everybody, for joining us this afternoon to attend this event hosted by Bright Blue in partnership with Viridor, titled Cleaner and Greener Households, Reducing and Reusing Waste. My name is Patrick Hall. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at Bright Blue. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get into things today. If you would like to tweet about this event, you can do so using the hashtags BrightBlue and CPC21. And if you'd like to follow us on Twitter, our handle is WeAreBrightBlue. You can also follow Viridor. Their Twitter handle is ViridorUK. So if you do want to ask a question, could I ask that you just wait until one of the roaming mics is given to you? The reason for this is that, as well as the in-person audience here today, we also have our digital audience being filmed from the back. So if you speak into the microphone, they can hear your question, provides a bit of context for when our panelists answer it. Cool. So without further ado, the key questions that we are asking today is, what is the economic and environmental impact of food and plastic waste? What further policies and technologies are needed to drive up recycling rates? Will a greater capacity of waste incineration be needed to process waste domestically? What role can waste to energy play in decarbonising home heating? How can the government support households to shift to low carbon energy without imposing too much of a financial burden on them? And lastly, what advantages and disadvantages does heat derived from waste to energy processes have over other forms of low carbon heating? So here to address all of those questions and more is our great panel. I'm joined to my left by Councillor Richard Clewer. Richard is the leader of Wiltshire Council and chair of the Countryside Climate Network. Natasha Clark, on the far right there, not politically, joins us. Natasha is the political correspondent for The Sun. And just to say, Natasha does have to nip away in 40 minutes, so just to note that. Tim Lord. Tim is a senior fellow of Net Zero at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And then Tim Rotheray is the Director of Innovation and Regulation at Viridor. So thank you very much to our panellists for joining us today. I'm going to hand over first to you, Natasha, to deliver your opening remarks.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. Sorry. There you go. Okay, we're all good. Yeah, thanks very much for having me. I was trying to think of some funny joke to open with, but then some of my colleagues in the press gallery where I was just there mentioned the fact that my suit is recycled, so I feel like I'm already doing my bit for the planet and for recycling. So there we go. I just wanted to start by sort of talking about, obviously, the challenge that we face. I'm not going to bang on too much about facts because I think all of us in the room probably know the challenge and the scale of it. The average household in the UK produces more than a tonne of waste every year. That's 31 million tonnes. It's incredible. The opportunity is huge. The challenge is huge. I think it sounds pretty self-explanatory to sort of say it like that. But when we are talking about household waste, we should also be thinking about, both the opportunity and the challenge of that. It's a double-edged sword, I guess, in a way. I guess when we sort of look down to food waste, we can obviously split it up. We can split it up into plastic waste. We can split it up into food waste. We're going to touch, I think, hopefully on waste incineration as well. And obviously energy all plays a big part in this. I think, obviously, the sexiest part, I think, of this in recent years has been plastic. Obviously, David Attenborough has done a lot to help push the boat out on this and plastic. And sorry about the plastic water bottles, guys. We've all been having a little bit joke about this one up here. But yes, it's obviously clear that plastic, the war on that, we're fighting that on a big scale now. That obviously the government has really got on board with this as an issue. Whether you rightly or wrongly agree with the idea of basically banning all forms of plastic, is that a good or a bad thing? We can sit here and discuss that in a bit. But I think government have clearly got on board that this is an issue. They're moving slowly on it. Obviously, we're looking towards banning plastic cutlery and cups next. I think that's the next one on the list after cotton buds or something like that. But yes, it's obviously an issue. DEFRA obviously got a lot on their plate, especially coming up with the Environment Bill, which I'm sure we'll see a lot of very important stuff going into that. But in terms of moving back towards households, obviously a lot of that comes from supermarkets. They are playing catch up, of course. Like, you even just have to look at how much waste that comes out of your supermarket shop, how much plastic. Everything is blooming wrapped in plastic. Really, really very upsetting. I did a no plastic I gave up plastic for Lent a couple of years ago. That was a really big challenge, I have to say. Like you can't shop at any big supermarket without buying plastic. It's incredible. And I think that's one of the big things that industry needs to look towards. And obviously the government are moving forward on this, but there's no incentive to move away from it at the moment. I think if we're going to look for recyclable, compostable things and alternatives to plastic, the government need to start looking at how they can incentivize supermarkets to do that. Because at the moment there is no real reason for them to do that. Plastic is cheap. Plastic keeps food how we want it. What are the alternatives to that at the moment? The industry's come on in Parliament where I work most of the time. You get the recyclable, compostable coffee cups, which makes you feel a little bit less guilty when you go and get your tea and coffee. That's great. But we need to do more, and we need to do more on supermarkets as well. But let's be honest, as a society, as a country, we're never not going to produce any waste. We can cut it down as much as we can, but we're never going to completely eliminate it. I think that's an important point to make. We need to remember that people are always going to want to get a cup of coffee on the go. They're always going to want to get a takeaway kebab at the end of the night, and that is going to come with some waste. So how can we make that as environmentally friendly as possible? And again, looking back to supermarkets, people are always going to need to shop in supermarkets. We're always going to need that food. It's not really about reducing it to zero, but more about taking the steps that we can to try and reduce that down. I think I just wanted to also touch on just recycling generally in this country, because it's a bit of a minefield. That is something that DEFRA are trying to tackle at the moment. They've said they want to standardise recycling across the board. Pretty big challenge. Not quite sure how they're going to do that yet. I don't think they know. I don't think they have sort of figured out exactly what they're going to do yet. It's great that we're moving in that direction. It's crazy that you can recycle plastic films in some places and other places you can't. I spend most of my life looking at the back of cartons going, can't recycle that. Can't recycle that. It's a great step forward that the government are finally looking at standardising that. It's a bit incredible that in 2021 we actually don't have a standardised recycling system across the country. That will be very, very welcome. I also wanted to just touch on food waste as well. A huge problem, and also sort of ties into my job at The Sun, sort of standing up for our readers who, some of them are on very low incomes. If we can do more to tackle food waste, it will be a good thing for them, not just in terms of helping the environment, helping cut those emissions, but also helping them save money. I think we need to be doing much more on that front. It's a win for them, it's a win for us. RAP Charity is doing some great work highlighting exactly how that can be done. I think that's sort of all. I feel like I've opened a can of worms here and not gone into too much detail. I leave that to the experts on the panel, but good to be talking to you, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Natasha. You've definitely opened the debate around the sort of public perception that plastic equals bad, and I'm sure that we can get into an interesting discussion about that when we move to the Q&A. But now I will hand over to you, Richard, for your opening remarks.
Thank you. I do apologise if I'm slightly disorganised. I'm stepping in at the last minute here, so hopefully I won't ramble. To try and find a way of expressing how important food and plastic waste are, I go up to Scotland every year to Skye. My mother has a house there, and when I'm up there, there is no petrol or energy apart from my own personal sort of energy, swimming output, whatever, involved in catching food. And I was out this year on one of the beaches that I get scallops from, snorkeling for them. And there were 4 huge containers, skips, being filled with the plastic that had accumulated on that beach. Now that's mostly fishing plastic, but looking through, there were all the usual suspects you find. How bits of Lego get up to the top of Skye is beyond me, but they do. So how important is plastic waste? It's absolutely critical. There's far too much of it. I'll come to that in a second. Food waste. I think probably the best thing we could do with food waste, best thing for my household that worked with food waste, was the book Save with Jamie. I bought it as a Christmas present. My wife didn't talk to me for the rest of the day. Then read it, and it's now the most used book in the house. It's pretty much falling apart, and it saved at least 25 quid on our weekly shopping bill, and the food waste has gone through the floor. But that's the sort of anecdotal bits. Coming on to perhaps the bigger picture. If I look at the whole issue of recycling as a local authority is downright tricky. We've got immense pressure to protect the environment. We've got pressure to reduce carbon, but we've also got people who are trying to live their lives, and life's hard enough without having to work out precisely what film you can recycle and what carton can and can't be recycled. I represent Wiltshire. We're a nice rural area. Most of us have some space, not all of us. If you're dealing with this in London, in flats, how on earth you're meant to split your recycling between your black bin waste, I'll use the Wiltshire terms, your blue bin waste, your recyclables, then possibly your glass, and now food waste on top. It's becoming really difficult, and we've got to remember as government that you catch far more flies with honey than with vinegar. We've got to make this easy for people, and we really run the risk of making it far too complicated. So food waste for me is a bit of a concern. It will take far more carbon to collect the food waste inside Wiltshire. There is no electric waste lorry that can travel the distances mine need to travel. And apparently, if you go with the battery versions, the moment you get a hill, they become difficult because of the weight of the lorries once you fill them up with the stuff you're collecting. Experts may tell me that's changed, but that's certainly the brief I had a year ago. So food waste, I'm not so sure whether collecting that's going to be great. We're going to have to do it. I'm not sure whether that's a great thing or not. But we have got to make sure whatever we're doing as government in all our forms, we're making it really easy for people to recycle. I think we've also got to remember the hierarchy. Here we are at a Conservative Party conference. What is it? Reduce. Well, that's pretty good on reduce. Reuse, recycle. Why we're having plastic water bottles, I don't know. We've got to demonstrate that change ourselves as well. All of us have got to. My sister embarrassed the hell out of a bunch of Euro MP candidates at the last election before we left Europe, because they were all sitting there talking about it and they were all using their single-use plastics. We've really got to get that ingrained into our psyche. But try and get your water bottle past security here, your metal one. They don't like it. I tried on the first day. It's in the hotel now. Coming on to some of those bigger issues. Incineration. Incineration is incredibly hard to get through the public. We've just had to approve an incinerator as an authority in Westbury. We didn't want to, let's be blunt, at planning, but national policy gave us no choice. Is it the right technology? Right now it's better than landfill, but I don't know if it's much better than landfill. If we can, there was no option but to do it, and it's caused significant strain and significant disruption and a significant retrograde step in persuading residents in that part of Wiltshire that they need to be recycling more and that they need to be doing more and addressing the green agenda, because they're really angry about the carbon generation that will be going on in Westbury. Better forms, biomass, a lot better, and other forms of heating systems would have been easier to get through. But again, I think we've got to be really careful with that, and we've got to be really careful to sell the benefits. We talk a lot about the circular economy. Whether it's truly achievable or not, I suspect not, but we've got to make a lot more headway there, and we've got to sell that as an idea if we are going to then bring people with us when we talk about what we deal with that residual waste, and there always will be residual waste. We've got to make supermarkets, central government has got to make supermarkets stop with the packaging. As has been said, we've worked too slowly on that. But then, if I come on, and I do apologise if it's slightly rambling, but if I come on to what that means for heating homes, the first thing that needs to be said whenever we discuss heating homes is the heating isn't the important bit. Fabric first. I'll reiterate that every time. Anything we do to insulate homes and reduce the amount of energy needed to go into them is an extremely, it's fundamental. It's the only first step that we should all be taking. I'm retrofitting 5,500 council houses in Wiltshire. We've got a plan to do it. We've started, and government funding is helping, but I'll do it with or without government funding, and that is primarily fabric first. But we can only get those to an EPCB. Now, for those of you who probably know more about EPCs than I do, that's not zero carbon, and to get a lot of them to zero carbon means tearing them down and building them again, which we can't afford to do. So there will be a residual heating need there that may or may not be met from renewables. So there is going to be a need to do something with that residual waste. And if we have a way of selling it to the public and using it to heat, great. Much easier if you can get heat networks, much easier if you can go into urban areas and put in proper distribution systems, much harder in the countryside. The one that hasn't been mentioned for the countryside and needs to be is compost. Why pick up food waste if we can compost it in our gardens and then use it to grow food to reduce the food miles? Hopefully that's an assessment from local government at least.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'd just be interested to know, in your experience, why was the public pushing back on having incineration? Was it a case of NIMBYism, or did they just oppose incineration more generally?
There is a huge fear about the particulate matters that will be released. Now, how genuine that fear is, I don't know. This is regulated by central government. I can't answer that, but I can tell you they are scared to the point that people have literally sold houses now that the planning permission has gone in for been approved for an incinerator. So we've lost the argument before we've even started there, because somewhere there is evidence that says the incinerator will generate particulate matter that will damage health. And perhaps that was a particular problem with the incinerator we were looking at. I'd need someone who has a better understanding to tell me whether there are versions of incinerators we could have sold to the public. But that one was an absolute no hope.
Thank you, Richard. Tim, Lord.
Thanks very much, and yeah, thanks for having me here. As a recovering civil servant, it's my first Conservative Party conference, and it's been really striking being here, seeing how much of the discussion is about net zero and climate change. So I was going to make my comments on waste in that context, because actually, we've actually done a pretty good job on waste in this country. We've got a lot to do, but whenever you go to a net zero event, people talk about the power sector, and wow, look at what we've done in the power sector in the last 10 years, and it's amazing. But we've cut waste emissions by about half since 2000, which actually compares not quite favourably, but pretty close to what we've achieved in the power sector. But we don't seem to spend any time learning the lessons from what we've achieved on waste for other parts of the economy, or indeed for what we do next on waste. And for me, there are kind of four things that we need to learn. One is around public understanding, one is around incentives, one is around making it easy, and one is around targeted and long-term regulation. Because if you look at what we achieved on waste, the public understanding is pretty good. It's an easier public understanding sell because you can see it, of course. The incentives in place, in particular in terms of things like the landfill tax, had a huge impact in terms of the way people thought about waste streams. We made it easier for people, not easy enough yet, as people have touched on. And the choice between a jug of water and a plastic bottle is a classic case that if you give people both, they'll probably choose the right one. But very often we don't give people those two choices. And then targeted regulations on things like local authorities, on councils, on supermarkets, although again not strong enough yet, have actually been pretty effective so far. So the key thing for me is about how do we take those lessons and apply them. And when we think about, for example, home heating, which I think people have been talking about a lot here, is probably the biggest challenge in terms of net zero. It's very hard to understand what I need to do to decarbonise my home. I don't have much incentive to do it. It's expensive, and it will probably cost me more in terms of my energy bill. Anyone who's tried to get a heat pump will know it's very hard to do that, and there's very little regulatory clarity that brings the supply chain through or makes consumers start planning 1, 3, 5, 10 years ahead, as opposed to looking at whatever subsidy regime happens to be in place at a particular point. So the question for me is kind of, how do we use waste behaviours, if you like, as a gateway drug for consumers, but also how do we use it for policymakers to start applying the lessons of some of the successes we've had in the context of other things on net zero. The other part of that story, of course, is actually if you look over the last 5 years or so, our waste emissions have pretty much flatlined. So we did very well for sort of 10 or 15 years after 2000, but we flatlined. And I think that shows some of the limitations of policy, again, which you can apply in waste and which you can apply elsewhere. In particular, the points that have been made around ease of choice for consumers. People will make the right choices if you make it easy and affordable for them to do that. At the moment, it's very hard if you try and give up plastic for Lent to still be able to kind of feed yourself in any kind of sensible way. And ease as well for local authorities and for people who are investing in the supply chain. What does the long-term policy context look like? Because that is what is going to drive the kind of investment we need. So for me, it's about looking back and learning those lessons, not just in the UK, but elsewhere, and how we apply them, not just in waste, but more broadly as well.
Thank you, Tim. And last but not least, to you, Tim Rotheray.
Thanks very much, Patrick. There's quite a lot in this debate, but I think perhaps just to start off with the waste as a challenge. 26 million tonnes of waste a year produced from homes. That doesn't include commercial industrial waste. 12 million tonnes of that is recycled, and 14 million tonnes of that goes to landfill or for recovery, energy from waste or incineration. That's kind of where we are as a sector. We've made really good progress, exactly like Tim said. And the things that we've made progress in are we've driven up recycling. Recycling rates really have gone from nothing to about 50%. And we diverted from landfill because of energy from waste. But it has absolutely flatlined in the last few years. And the sector, it was really interesting to see Treasury's assessment, their midterm net zero assessment, showed the sector to be the 7th largest source of greenhouse gases in the UK. So it's gone a long way, but it's still got quite a long way to go. But heat is also a problem, and my background previously was in heat and looking at heat, and it's 38% of our energy carbon emissions come from heat, and heat is either bad or boring. It either doesn't work and it's a crisis, or it's just really dull. It's not like an electric car, which is cool, or even solar panels. It's just dull or a disaster. And so getting people really excited about both of these things is really, really tricky. But in terms of reducing waste, and in terms of reducing what we're dealing with as a country, driving up recycling is absolutely critical, and we've got binding targets now to achieve 65% by 2035. The Climate Change Committee reckons that we can do 70% by 2030, and that would reduce our domestic non-recyclable waste to 9 million tonnes. But given that half of what we're doing, the 40 million tonnes, is still going to landfill, we're still not where we need to be. And we looked at this as a business and said, well, what is it that we can do to get our business to net zero? Because the thing that's really interesting with net zero, rather than an 80% reduction, is that no one can hide. When it was an 80% cut, I reckon that 50% of the economy considered themselves to be in the 20% that didn't need to bother doing anything. And then when it's 100%, you're like, well, actually, this is going to affect everyone. And we looked at it, and we saw two things. The first thing is plastics. Plastics account for about 16% of what goes into the non-recyclable waste, energy from waste and landfill. It accounts for 70% of the fossil emissions of an energy from waste plant. So if you take 16% of the waste out, you reduce the emissions by about 70%, but also you reduce the number of energy from waste plant you need, because you can put more waste through them. Because I won't go into the details about calorific value and lots of geeky stuff, but you can increase your throughput, so you reduce the number of energy from waste plant you need. So that's the first thing. But also, if you recycle plastic, and we absolutely need to drive down unnecessary plastic, but we don't want to be in a world where we turn it into an evil product, because it is really, really useful, and the alternatives are often worse. The thing that really gets me is the alternative milk cartons, you know, the cashew nut and the almond milk, and those boxes that they're all in are incredibly difficult to recycle, with a plastic exterior and then cardboard and then a foil and then a plastic and a polypropylene top. Really difficult to recycle. Your milk bottle in your house has an 86% probability of being recycled. That box, I don't know what the probability is, but it's very low. So getting plastic out, but also if we recycle plastic, we halve the emissions compared to virgin plastic. So the sector as a whole emits about 15 million tonnes of CO2 doing recycling, but the recycling itself saves 50 million tonnes of CO2 in its emissions. So we've got to do increased recycling. And film, you were mentioning earlier, Natasha, 400,000 tonnes a year of film put on the market, 5% of it gets recycled. And that is mainly because it's not collected. We just can't get contracts for it. So getting plastic out is key, but it still doesn't take away the fact that you're going to have residual waste. And waste is always near where people are, by definition. Energy from waste ends up being there where people are. And if we have, one of the biggest problems is decarbonising heat. One of the things that we've looked at is we actually should be supplying heat from those energy from waste plants into the homes, actually into city centres, which are the hardest bit of the building stock to decarbonise. It's much easier to do new build, it's much easier to do suburbia, but trying to do city centres is really hard. So take the heat that comes from the people who are putting the bins out in the first place is a really worthwhile thing. And then the second thing that we looked at is actually saying, well, we still have carbon in those flue gases. Roughly a tonne of waste emits a tonne of CO2, half of it fossil, half of it renewable. We should be capturing that carbon. And if you capture the carbon, you can actually take the sector from being a climate emitter to a net negative emitter of CO2, so that you're capturing more CO2 than we emit as a sector. And so actually, you could cut to a world, and it's a really positive story to tell people, to deal with the understandable concerns that people in communities have, which is that when you put your recycling out and you put your bin up, you're actually contributing to dealing with climate change. And if we put carbon capture on the back of it, you could actually end up getting net negative emission heat back from the bins that you put out on a weekly basis.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to open the floor for questions in a second, but I just thought I would abuse my privilege as chair just to ask you, we've seen a moratorium on incineration in Wales. We know that Scotland are considering one. In light of this, and given the fact that we are going to have to process more of our waste domestically, should we really be looking to massively upscale incineration, particularly in England?
No, I think that the mantra with incinerating waste has got to be as little as possible, as much as necessary. We want as few as we possibly can get away with, but the one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to landfill it. Every single tonne that you landfill emits 150 kilos per tonne more CO2 equivalent over its lifetime, and it also does other things like creates leachate, which is the liquid that comes out the bottom of the landfill, and it's a much harder to manage process and creates a long legacy. You know, a landfill site, even after it's closed, has a 60 to 70 year legacy of management associated with it. So we should build as much as we need to, but as little as possible.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to open the floor to questions if anybody has one, and I'm also will be taking questions from our virtual audience as well. So if you see me looking at my phone, I'm not being terribly rude. I'm just looking at the questions that are coming through to me from our digital audience. But to start off, there is a question over here. This gentleman.
I've probably got 3 points here. I've come from the the heat pump session downstairs. I've just been in that one, and it's probably like the 3 things here are the gentleman here. Sorry, I don't know. Can't remember your name. So second from the left. What you just said is absolutely right. I mean, your 4 points you made are spot on in terms of. I mean, it's including the simplify. It's got to be really simple for residents to actually to do it, and it's got to really, really simple to understand it. I mean, I've got a professional daughter who's married to a consultant cardiologist. I mean, I live in Sale. I live 6 miles away. We're in the GM area, so it's a collective waste situation going on there. And if they don't really get into fully recycling, as very intelligent professional people, how can we possibly expect others to be doing it with the 4 bins and this, that, and the other? So, I mean, it really has got to be simple. The second thing I'll say to the gentleman here from Wiltshire is, like, you use the word, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, we've got to do that. Well, just do it, please. Don't talk about we've got to do it. Do it. It's like when someone said, I've tried to phone you. Well, what do you mean you tried to phone me? Did you pick up the phone? Did you dial a number? We hear that all the time. People use that phrase, I tried to call you. Did you? How? Did you? Anyway, but you've used the phrase, got to, at least 4 times. Do it. But just going back to the what we do and what we don't recycle. You talk about the bottles on the table. I mean, the perception actually is that plastic bottles are fine because we recycle them. So that is the public's perception, isn't it? You buy a bottle of water, you buy a bottle of Lucozade, whatever it is you buy a can, whether it's of Red Bull or whether it's of Coca-Cola, we recycle aluminium cans. That's fine. So that's in the public perception, isn't it? You move on to other sorts of plastic, and I mean, I've got a WhatsApp message from a resident today, and this is about Wiltshire Farm Foods, okay, who have changed their packaging so that the plastics they use are the same as are used in the bottles, which are recyclable. But Trafford or GM don't accept those into the bottle can recycling because the quality, actually, although it's the same plastic, the quality of that plastic that they use in their food trays is not as good as the quality of the same plastic they use in the bottles. And the people that are actually taking it and using it to recycle don't want it. So it's another big area. And then we get into the things like, we all got yogurt pots, haven't we, where we've got paper wrappers around the outside. The plastics that's used in that, extraordinarily strong for its weight, is quite valuable, but we don't recycle it. It just goes in the bin. There's just so much, isn't there? Sorry, I've just gone on, but those are the 3 bits, really. But, I mean, basically, the biggest one of all is somehow getting across to every one of 60 million, or probably adults, let's say 50 million plus people, a simple guide to really how they really recycle more and more and more of what they produce.
Well, I think
even
there's
if it's
a lot
only
there.
1% more in GM, it saves more than £1 million.
Well, there's a lot there for you to pick up on, Richard. So I'll hand over to you first, and then I'll come to you, Natasha, perhaps about how we should be simplifying recycling. So, Richard.
Yeah, the phrase "got to do it," we do, but how delivering that just isn't as simple as saying doing it. The problem comes with the different responsibilities and the need for central government to provide the frameworks, and then for there to be a market for the recycling. And technology needs to catch up. In Wiltshire, you cannot at the moment recycle black plastic trays because the flaming laser can't see black plastic trays. That can't be an insoluble problem, but on the mechanical sorting system, black plastic trays cause a problem and therefore reduce the recyclability of the waste, and therefore they're not recyclable. It needs a holistic view. I can't tell. Well, Wiltshire Farm Foods, actually, I think they're based in Trowbridge, but the only time I've ever seen them is in Scotland, actually. But yeah, I have no control over the packaging they use. That's something central government can dictate. I can't. And that's where my, I guess, frustration comes in, and the term "got to." And I do think the word "got to" needs to be applied to an awful lot of things. I will digress very slightly only for a second. House building. We're discussing how to deal with retrofitting housing. We're building flaming houses right now that will all need retrofitting in 15 years because no one in government is flicking the switch to say, build zero carbon. As a council, we can do it. It costs 4% more. There was a company we couldn't use because of a EU contract framework system that would have been 1% more. The "got to" word, yes, I will use it a lot, and there are people who have the ability, there are places with the ability to deal with this. The industrial recycling, or the industrial method by which we recycle different materials, I'm no idea. I know it's complicated.
And Natasha, I'll come to you around how we make recycling more simple.
I don't know. I'm definitely not an expert on how we do that. But your point that we need to do it is absolutely true. But yeah, the how is obviously the harder question. No, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But I know that it needs to be. I mean, I guess the other people on the panel probably know better than me. But is it not the case that we can, with automated sorting systems, when the government does finally get around to standardising recycling, is it not that we can have a system where everybody puts something into one bin and that is sorted out later on down the line? Because that sounds like a very simple solution. It sounds idealistic. Maybe that doesn't quite work, but it might be a very simple solution. It also might create some more jobs down the end of the line, maybe.
Tim Rotheray?
Yes.
How far away from that?
Yeah, is that actually possible?
So
Or am I pie in the sky?
So no, it is possible, and it is what we do broadly at the moment. It is actually the complete opposite of where DEFRA's going at the moment.
That's upsetting to hear.
So DEFRA is going down a separate route of separate collection of paper and card and metal and glass and plastic.
So are we going to have 20 bins in future?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, not necessarily, but there will be different bins, and there is an interesting playoff in that if you do the separation at home, you get a much lower level of contamination, which means you get much better quality of recycling. But it also means that the local authorities get more value because the material's worth more. And most of these contracts now work that you effectively pay to collect the material, or you're paid to collect it, but then you refund back the value of that material to the local authority, and therefore the value of the recycler really matters. But in two things, one on simplicity. There are a lot of different types, for example, of plastic. There's 7 or 8 different grades of paper. It's not a really easily standardised things. They are recycled products. They're not the commodity that you get when you just buy plastic when it's first made. But having some simple signage on things is the thing that we've been saying to DEFRA. Like a blue circle, a red triangle, a black square, or what, you could, and if it was the same everywhere, and you saw that sign when you were out and about, if it was in your home, if it was in your office, make a huge difference. Recycling rates are generally quite good in the home. They are really bad in your office. Go to your office and see what recycling's like. You might be lucky if there's a paper bin. There probably isn't a plastics bin. There won't be a food waste bin unless you work in a very concerned office. But the other thing that is really worth saying on this is that the reason that we're able to build energy from waste plant is that we go to a local authority and have the discussion. They say, we've got this much waste and we know how much it's going to be for the next 20 years, and we'll sign an agreement for 20 years. If you want to do recycling, they go, we've got some, but we're quite worried about how the price is going to go up and down, which is totally understandable. So we'll do a 3-5-year deal. And then the result of that is that the contract that you have is not enough to invest in the really high quality technology that you could build. So we've looked at robotics and AI and all these kind of things, but they're really expensive. You know, like a robot is multi-million-pound piece of kit. And if you've got a contract for 5 years, you can't justify the investment. So what you end up doing is you end up building the cheapest possible asset that you can in order to meet the requirements of the contract, and the quality of the recycling goes down. Or worse, you export it, which no one wants to happen. So one of the things that has been really effective in energy from waste was it was actually originally a central government framework which led to long-term contracts, and then local authorities have adopted those long-term contracts. We have to put in place something similar so that we can go, right, we'll do a 20-year contract and we'll build you a state-of-the-art piece of equipment. We will take responsibility for the quality and the volume of what we produce. And in that way, you'll actually get the kind of recycling, and you'll get the jobs, and you get the infrastructure investment that goes with it. Because at the minute, the plastic concern is absolutely about what's not recycled, but it's also about the things that get exported. But it's really, really difficult to build infrastructure when someone only gave you a 3-year contract.
I'm really glad you mentioned AI there, because the guy who's on about yogurt pots with the cardboard around the outside was saying exactly that to me. Surely we're moving towards artificial intelligence, sorting all this stuff out into the different types and what have you. Derek just said, well, isn't it just around the corner?
The machines
are.
are.
To him and say, yes, it is, Derek. As long as the GM waste will give them a 20-year contract to look at it.
If you get the opportunity to go to one of your local MRFs, a materials recycling facility.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. No, we had a meeting on Friday in the local accounts and audit, and just before COVID, we were about to go to a plough, and I raised it, and we are going to make a visit.
The machinery is incredibly clever, and if you see the speed at which they separate, they identify between different plastics, so they will know that a plastic milk bottle and this bottle are two different types of plastic, and they do it. It all works very well. Investing it's incredibly difficult.
Thank you, Tim. I just wanted to pick up on something that Richard mentioned, actually, around non-recyclable black plastic. Tim Lord, do you think that should we be just banning black plastic? I mean, why is it used as opposed to different types of plastic that are recyclable?
I mean, I think it depends on, can alternatives do the job and do the job as effectively, and in some cases that will be true, and in some cases that'll be less true. But I do think there is a really important role for kind of choice editing for consumers here. We've already used the example of the water. Even if you walk around this conference venue, there's some bins where you just chuck anything in, and there's some where there's 3 bins, and people will separate if there's 3 bins, and they probably won't even notice they've done it, and they certainly won't complain about it. And I think the more and I think, as Richard said, that's on central government. You can't do that at local authority level. You have to do that centrally. So the more you're thinking about where can you choice edit, the better. That doesn't mean that all plastic is evil or wrong, as someone said, but it does mean that very often there are alternatives that work better, and I think consumers will be very happy to have. In the same way in the housing example, people don't buy a brand new house because it's a kind of 2-story building to put your boiler in. They buy a house and they don't really care what the heat source is, and it's again for central government. I think to take some of those kinds of decisions. So the more, there is a consumer responsibility here, of course, but I think there's a really important role for government and in terms of influencing the kind of people who sell us stuff to take the responsibility away from consumers and place it on suppliers and providers and get the incentives right for them to get things like black plastic out of the waste chain.
Thank you, Tim. I'm just going to put some online questions that we've received from our virtual audience to the panel. So I'm going to come to you, Tim Rotheray, on this one. Robin asks, is there a country that the panel look to as an especially shining example in terms of reducing waste, and why?
So the most impressive stats I've seen is for Japan. Recycling rates of metal in Japan is like 98%. It's incredibly high. And the reality is that they're normally done by two things. One is absolutely make it simple for people. I think it's quite amazing that our sector depends entirely on what people do voluntarily in their spare time at home and how well they separate it for how well our industry works. So you have to make it simple. And the second thing, you do have to have the financial incentives to do things right. And there are reforms now going through in the UK to make the producers responsible for the recyclability of their packaging, because you can only get those very high levels of recyclability if you can extract the materials that you need to. You know, if you look at you look at all kinds of things, but even something like a plastic bottle, how well it's been designed, or whether someone's thought about the cost of recycling it, has a fundamental effect on whether or not you're actually able to recycle it to such a high level.
Thank you. And Tim Lord, do you think where could the UK be taking inspiration from overseas in terms of waste policy?
I think Japan's a great example. I think you see some cities that have done a particularly good job. But I don't know every country's example. But I think in general, where people have shown kind of political bravery, if you like, on this kind of subject, they find the public are generally quite willing to go with them. You know, to Tim's point, no one makes anyone recycle, right? We recycle half of our waste, and you know, nothing will happen if we don't. Just put everything in a black bin, nothing will happen to you. So there is a real public willingness, and personally, I think a public willingness more widely on environmental, low carbon behaviours. That if you have the political bravery to kind of take advantage of that, and by explaining to people what they can do, that's what tends to work.
We've got another question here from James. Natasha, I might put this to you. It asks, does the panel think that we have a problem with greenwashing in the UK? It's quite a broad question, but perhaps maybe we could frame that in the context of waste and recycling.
It's really hard to say that something is greenwashing when the government are saying you have to get to net zero by 2050. And is that greenwashing when you come up with policies to do that? Because that is exactly what the government are telling everybody to do. You know, my inbox is constantly filled with press releases from companies being like, hey, we're doing this to go green, hey, we're doing this to go green. And like, while it is great to see companies doing more and more, you obviously get the backlash from people saying you're just doing this greenwashing. This is, you know, you're not really making any real change. I think personally, I think that it's better that companies are taking steps towards that than not taking any steps towards that. In terms of waste, I'm sure it's something that I imagine you know, that they want to get on top of before, you know, they're pushed to do so. And obviously DEFRA are doing this more and more, and I'm sure that I don't see it as greenwashing. Like I say, I see it as more they're just trying to get ahead of the game, really, and you know, before they're essentially taxed on their profits if they're not going green, if they're not being recyclable. I don't know if that is greenwashing or not, but I think we all have to be, you know, as consumers, and also, you know, in the jobs that we all do, you know, cautious and skeptical of companies, and when they're making these big commitments to go green, and look at exactly what they're doing and whether it is making an impact. But I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that they're being sort of forced to look at their sustainability and their sort of eco-credentials more and more.
Thank you, Natasha. Are there any other questions from the floor? I'll go first to Josh here at the front.
Thanks. Josh Buckman from Flint. I've been to a fair few fringe events during this conference, and most of them obviously have been on net zero. Most of them Natasha's been talking very eloquently at. But they've all been on net zero. Nothing really on circular economy and the wider environmental pitch. There's obviously been kind of a wider focus, but how do we ensure that there is enough political focus on this issue and the creation of a circular economy and the connectivity that has, obviously, to the climate agenda, as you were describing earlier, which ensures, therefore, the policy and regulatory kind of frameworks at both national and local level come through. Because you've seen the trajectory of the net zero agenda is really galvanised. How do we do similar in this space?
And I think there was another question, this gentleman here in the green tie.
Thank you. On CCUS, what's required from government and also private investment to get that scaled up, so we can actually realistically see CCUS energy from waste plants in the UK at a sort of broader scale?
Thank you. So on the first question around how do we put a circular economy on par with net zero, Richard, I might go to you first with respect to that question.
It's not at all easy on the circular economy side, because we're still struggling to really see what that means. I think people look at it with a degree of scepticism. But I think if we go to the slightly bigger picture, the environment side, I represent a rural authority. I chair Countryside Climate Network. If I want to talk to my residents, if I talk to them about carbon, it's a shrill voice, it's Extinction Rebellion, sticking themselves to things and being idiots, and it just goes down like a lead balloon. If I want to talk to them about how we improve the environment of Wiltshire, including carbon, that's when they all come up and say, yes, brilliant, amazing. With the exception of wildflowers, if I go to the pub now, I get attacked with all the different views on the wildflower groups. That one seems to be a particularly incendiary issue that I wasn't expecting. So we need to push the environment really hard in rural areas, and there's very good evidence that shows that political engagement, if you want to engage people living in rural, semi-rural areas, don't talk about climate change, talk about the environment and add climate change in on the back. If you want to talk in the cities, climate change is probably the way to go in. How we extend that to the circular economy, we're going to need some very simple examples of what that means beyond the recycling of a can or a plastic bottle. And I think that's going to require business, supermarkets in particular, potentially to take the lead there, because at the moment that's the one that they all complain about. And the government may well need to force them to take the lead. But no, we don't talk about, we're putting through a climate change strategy at the moment. It's not called a climate change strategy. It's basically linked into a blue-green infrastructure plan. It's an environment strategy. That's how we get the engagement.
Tim Rotheray, I wonder if you wanted to pick up on this gentleman's point around CCUS.
Yeah, so what do we need to make it happen? So in energy from waste sector, we actually asked Eunomia to do a little bit of work, a consultancy, because carbon capture and storage has been focused on really heavy industry and power, and the government hasn't looked at it for the waste sector, but the Climate Change Committee said you have to use it to get the sector to net zero. And we kind of thought, well, actually, this is something we should look at. The piece of work that Eunomia did said the government's got 5 main clusters. Of the 50 plants that exist in the UK, 15 of them are within 20 miles of those clusters. If you connected them up, they would deliver 5 million tonnes of CO2 into those clusters a year by 2030, which is 50% of the government's carbon capture target. So individually, those plants often look quite small, but collectively they're actually quite a significant contributor. What is it that we need to make it happen? Well, we've got to put energy from waste into the industrial capture model, the business model that the government's developing to enable businesses to invest in industrial carbon capture. Industrial carbon capture it's not going to happen. In fact, like every other form of decarbonisation, when you start doing it, it's not going to happen on its own. It requires policy. Policies in place for chemicals, for refining, for cement sector. We need to extend it to energy from waste. And that is the thing that needs to happen. And if we do that, then we'll actually start to be able to put carbon capture on. We've got our largest plant, Runcorn, which is just near here. That takes Manchester's waste. It's 1 million tonnes a year. It's the largest in the UK. We want to put carbon capture on it, and that will capture nearly 1 million tonnes a year of carbon dioxide to put into the high net cluster. So that's what we want to do. And what was interesting was that when Eunomia did the work that they did, is that when they said if you actually have clusters, if you look at energy from waste in those clusters, then they are one of the cheapest forms of carbon capture. It came in at £66 a tonne. So and the next cheapest I think was 80. So it seems like there's an opportunity there. But unless we can participate in the policy, we won't be able to do it.
Tim Lord, I wonder if I could come to you now. CCUS is still quite expensive and it's very nascent, but it's talked about a lot, particularly when we have these discussions at party conference around net zero. What do we need to be seeing from government to scale up CCUS?
So I think we do talk about it a lot, and one of the reasons for that, I think Tim made the point earlier that before we had a net zero target, there was a lot of uncertainty about what we had to do in order to achieve an 80% target, whereas a net zero makes it all is quite clarifying. And one of the things it clarifies is that you absolutely need CCS. You can't really get there without it. It's very hard to produce a model run or see how you could get there. So first of all, you need it. Secondly, you need to commit to it, and the government has done more on that. So they've committed to, I think, a 10 million tonne target. That's from a standing start in 10 years. That's pretty tough to achieve that. But the key thing is, at the moment, we don't have an investment case for it, right? Because if you look at all of the technologies we need for net zero, the only one that has a really copper-bottomed investment case is renewable power, where you get a contract for difference. And that's been in place for, 7 years or so now. And you've seen renewable power go through the roof, and people are building a lot of it, and the costs are coming down, and the jobs are coming as a result of it. Whereas if you look at anything else, whether it's heat pumps or CCS, the investment case is not there. So how do we put a value on that ton of carbon is the key thing, and how do you guarantee that value for someone who's actually going to go and build a plant with a 10, 15, 20, 30 year payback is the thing that we absolutely have to do. I think the other thing is putting it in the right place and with the right technologies. And one of the big challenges is when you talk to industrial emitters is, am I going to be here in 20 or 30 years' time or not? Because if you build a lot of CCS infrastructure and I'm not here, then that's going to obviously going to be a bit of a problem. So, waste feels to me like a good area for us to be looking at that, because one of the things we can be pretty sure of is we'll still be producing some stuff that we're going to have to burn in 10, 20, 30 years' time. Hopefully less of it. Hopefully we can concentrate it to the stuff that we absolutely need to. But that feels like quite a good place for us to be starting to look at doing it, and doing it pretty quickly, because, as I say, going from 0 to 10 million tonnes and potentially to 30, 50, 100 million tonnes by 2050 is no small challenge.
Thank you, Tim. Was there a further question over here? This gentleman at the back.
So I've actually got a comment, a question, and a plug. So apologies, Chair. The first one is a comment. Your point about the 80-20 target and 50% of the economy thinking they were part of that 20%, I think, is a great point. And obviously the net zero target is a massive improvement on that, but there's still a wiggle room there because it's not a zero target, it's a net zero target. And so there were some industries which won't be able to decarbonise completely, so they will have to use offsetting, and I feel like offsetting has the potential for a real Wild West, and we need to ensure some standardisation there. The plug, and I'm saddened that this gentleman is no longer here, but the University of Manchester is running a pilot scheme called the One Bin to Rule Them All project around plastic recycling, working with local authorities in Greater Manchester and companies as well to use chemical and mechanical recycling to get more economic value from its plastic waste. My question, and apologies for the preamble, is around the right to repair legislation that's come in this year. Do we think that's going to make a significant difference? Do we think we can extend it? It applies to certain things at the moment, but there's probably much more that we could look to there.
Tim Lord, I might come back to you on that one around the right to repair legislation. And then Natasha, I'll come to you on the gentleman's first point around offsetting. Do you think that we need to have a criteria around offsetting to ensure that it's done in a transparent and genuine way? So I might go to Tim first, and then to you, Natasha. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think on right to repair, I worked on a lot of legislation when I was in government, and the key thing is, I think it can be really effective, but it's how you do the legislation matters a lot. So first of all, are you making very, very clear who has responsibilities and exactly what they are responsible for? Because it's a classic thing where you could end up fudging that a bit and therefore not getting the kind of impact and the kind of compliance you need. And the second thing is the responsibility on the sector to make it easy and clear for consumers, because it's quite easy to discharge that responsibility. Of course, you could have come and repaired it, but if I didn't tell you, you could have come and repaired it. If I didn't make that a key part of the offering that I'm making, then it won't be as effective. So I think it can be hugely impactful, but it matters a lot, and I think the government will need to feel the pressure on it a little bit for it to be important. Just really quickly on offsetting, because I think you're dead right about the kind of the risk of a Wild West. The problem with net zero, which I'm generally very supportive of, is you have to get rid of essential emissions and then you offset the rest, right? And it's how do you define essential emissions? Because I can tell you what, if you talk to a big oil and gas company in Saudi Arabia, they will have a very different view of what an essential emission is to an Extinction Rebellion protester. And that to me is a debate that we're not really having yet, and that we need to have pretty quickly, because the technologies like direct air capture and so on that we need that can help us do that, do the real essential emissions, are not going to be deployable at the kind of scale we need and on the kind of timescale we need to tackle what a big oil company might see as an essential emission.
Natasha, do you have any further thoughts on that? Do you think offsetting is giving people this sort of social license to emit?
Yeah, definitely. It is a worry. And, you know, dare I say, is carbon capture a type of offsetting? Like, it is in a way. Like, you know, I'm not saying it's a bad thing in any way. But you're right, Tim. You know, eventually there will be, you know, we're never going to get completely rid of emissions. There will be, slithers of society that just can't decarbonise, and they just can't decarbonise fast enough. A lot of companies are going to be looking for that as their way out, and we need to be, you know, a little bit wary of that and whether that's really true. But also how we measure it and how we measure offsetting is going to be really important as well, and how companies themselves measure it. Are they going to be trusted to measure their own offsetting? You know, that sort of sets us up for a problem later down the line where, you know, you've got companies essentially setting their own rules and saying, yes, we're offsetting our carbon by X, Y, and Z. And is anybody going to police that? Is anybody going to look at that? Is anybody going to sort of put the parameters in place for what effectively offsetting means and how much of it you can do? Are we going to say to sectors, you can actually offset all of your emissions, or are we just going to say to them, you can do some of it and you have to, you know, cut them down in other ways? Yeah, we haven't even started a conversation about that.
Yeah,
Tim.
Yeah, just it's a really important point about carbon capture. I used to be a real skeptic about carbon capture because I was kind of like, this is big infrastructure that people get excited about, and it's a kind of sticking plaster to actually failure to deal with the fundamental thing, which is that we should do things differently. And there is a risk that carbon capture has with that. When we looked at our sector, we ended up with CCS being the thing at the end that you have to do when you've done everything else. So that's what I kind of said, like, you've got to get the plastic out of the waste, you've got to increase recycling rates, but you get to a point, and some sectors I don't think are in this place, some sectors are just trying to resist change. In ours, we're nervous that we won't be able to achieve a net zero without some carbon capture. And that it comes back to that greenwashing question, doesn't it? Which is it's a real risk for the sector to if we're seen as kind of like, oh well, we'll just stick it all under the ground, it's not a problem. It's sort of that's a risk, but you have to judge the process in each sector sort of by what you can achieve, and I think some will use carbon capture as a license to pollute, and others it becomes your essential route to achieving the goal that you set.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, just to add slightly there. As a council, I've been looking to set, well, we've committed to decarbonise the council by 2030. We've taken out 80% of the emissions so far since 2015, most of them in the last 2 years. That remainder, some of it is going to involve some form of carbon capture, carbon storage. There's no way based on any technology we've got at the moment, given some of the emissions we've got left to deal with, that we will get to all of them without it. Carbon trading, I think, is a terrible idea. It's got to be done in a way where it can't just be used that I'm paying and I'm still able to pollute. It's got to be something that's more responsible than that. But it is going to be an essential part of any large organisation achieving zero carbon. You can probably do it for a house, but for a large organisation, it just doesn't work.
Richard, there's another question here for you specifically from Nick, one of our virtual viewers, which says, how can we get career politicians to actively engage in the detailed technicalities of recycling and waste policy? Is it even possible?
Desirable.
No, I don't think it's possible. I'm not sure it's entirely desirable, but there needs to be a greater comprehension. Gosh, there are a couple of answers to that. If we look at central government's surrounded by teams of people, civil servants, SPADs, advisors, whatever, who will pull together the information and pull together evidence and advise politicians. And the politicians need to understand what they're being told, and they need to get advice from industry, but make sure that industry advice is genuine and not based simply around making money and whatever it is that industry wants to push. And if you, well, certainly since becoming leader of the council in May, the number of people who've got wonderful solutions for me has gone through the roof. But then central government, somewhere in there, has got to understand what the people are actually how they're going to interact with it. I'm so fed up with policies from central government. Cycling policy might work in London, but you try and apply cycle lanes to Wiltshire, all it does is annoy people. because we take away some of their on-street parking, and you need it. You've got to have a car to get around Wiltshire. We're a big county with very little public transport, and all we do is annoy them. And it's so hard for government to listen to the issues that are being put forward by the different parts of the country. Recycling in flats in London will be a totally different matter to me. I've got 4 large bins in my garden, and the recycling goes in them, and I'm fanatical. But if I was living in a flat with no space, how on earth am I going to be, particularly then if you're on a comparatively low income, struggling to pay your rent, struggling to heat your house, it's not going to be a priority. So somewhere in there, politicians or some central government has got to talk to local government, because we actually know what's going on the ground, but can't set that big policy. And that, I think, is the real key to pretty much every element we're dealing with decarbonisation, probably apart from transport, where I hope technology and industry will solve that one for us. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. I've got another question from a virtual viewer, Becky, who says, the last resident pod of killer whales off northwest Scotland are doomed to extinction due to pollutants. What can we do to manage the PCB pollution? Tim Rotheray, I might go to you first on this one.
Well, that's quite... All of the... Well, there's a couple of things. I think the first thing is product design. So actually where the material that ends up as waste comes from is the first thing. So, you know, the reason that we have pollutants is because those pollutants have been deemed useful in the production of some form of product, and then we end up with them at the end, and dealing with that can be really tricky. So, for example, PVC plastic is almost impossible to recycle, but also produces hydrochloric acid when it burns, and which is not very nice stuff. So banning PVC, which is actually what I'm pretty sure we use for yogurt pots, because the crack when you do that, that's why they use PVC. So product design, getting product design right, and then driving up the recycling rates, because an awful lot of these materials, which are artificially made materials, are actually things that should be being recycled, and so you don't want to end anywhere near an energy recovery facility in the first place, which is, I'm assuming, where this question is coming from.
I've got a question here from this gentleman at the front.
Hi, thank you for the panel, for having the meeting. My name's Rob Hollier. I run a company called Reuse World. We've been operating for 15 years, but doing previous stuff to that. Reuse rather than recycling is something that's going to become very, very important, and it's something that I remember my cousin once sort of said to me that, you know, trying to recycle glass bottles or jars or anything takes a lot more energy to put in, and it was like, and like to sort of like bring together a lot of the things that you said, and I don't want to ramble as well either, Richard, like you said, because I will ramble if I, like the previous gentleman. It's what it comes down to really is elbow grease. Unfortunately, in my experience of recycling and reusing, it comes down to how much work that you're going to put into it. But then it also comes down to your insight and your sort of natural sort of ability to. And the one thing that I'd say, Tim, is Doug Parr from Greenpeace yesterday said, you know, I asked him a question because everyone was saying that we've got 50% towards, but that's the low-lying fruit. We're not 50%. We've done 50% of the low-lying fruit. We've got a big tree to climb, and it's going to take some effort and elbow grease. And the other thing that I'd say, Richard, is with your food waste. Surely you've got a rat problem with that as well. If you were doing it, sort of like putting it into the, because that's exactly what I got, and it's those sorts of things that you suddenly, you know, you're like, oh yeah, we're doing it. We're greenwashing it. We're doing it. Oh, Christ, we've got a rat problem. You know? And I'm a naturalist and a conservationist. I love rats. I think they're great. They're part of my circular environment. You know, for me, it's about it's not. I'm an economist, but I'm very much into the circular economy. But it's also about the circular environment. So not so much of a question, but just a rounding up from my point of view on all of your statements.
Have you got a rat problem, Richard?
Gosh, in different bits of Wiltshire, there are some areas where we do. I mean, every city centre has got rats, but equally there are a couple of areas where we've got rat problems caused by farms. So it's quite variable. It's not particularly an issue from waste at the moment. We were told when we went to fortnightly collections it would be, and no, it hasn't been. But again, in urban areas, that's why we've got to listen to people who understand what's going on in different areas. There's no one solution for all. On the point about reusing, yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, the right to repair will be great. We've got to get better at making our things last longer. My dishwasher broke about 3 years ago, and the pumps, the filter's always going, the impeller gets stuck, and I couldn't make it work. And I thought, oh, I better go and get a new one, go down to the shop and buy one. And I thought, no, I'm going to take this seriously. So we got the right tools. We had ordered them from Amazon, had to wash up by hand for a few weeks, well, about a week in the end, and then took it apart and took the pump apart and actually made the damn thing work. And 3 years on, we haven't had to replace the dishwasher. And now the tumble dryer, the handle's gone, and I can't get a new door. Hopefully, under the right to repair, I will. So we've now worked out. My daughter worked out how to use a screwdriver to open the door. So yeah, we do have to do that. And we've got to get better. And those recycle sheds, the bike sheds, whatever they are, the repairing sheds are becoming increasingly popular, and we need to put more effort into that too.
One of the things, a much bandied around word.
Sorry, just wait for the microphone to
a much bandied around word. A much bandied around word has always been sustainability, and that's exactly the thing that we've been plugging for the last sort of 10 years is longevity. You know, and that's something that really we need to, you know, incorporate into our sort of social psyche, I think.
Are there any further questions from our audience here? Just one here for this gentleman.
Lewis van der Gaal, British Soft Drinks. Wonder if panellists could express views on how COVID may have changed consumer views or even industry views on cleaner, greener households, and whether that's been a distraction or, you know, put us off course, so to speak.
Tim Lord, I'll go to you first on that one.
I've never thought about how COVID will impact on recycling, I must admit. I mean, I think the one thing I would say is kind of public information is a bit of a kind of dirty word these days, or dirty phrase these days. We do very little communication with the public on any of this stuff. And to your point about reducing and reusing, people don't understand the waste hierarchy that well, right? But that's sort of fair enough because they've never had it explained to them. And I saw some polling recently that had, you know, 85% of people worried about climate change. And then they were then asked to rank 10 things about which one has most impact on my emissions. And they literally, it was almost precisely the inverse of the right answer. And that isn't their fault, that's because no one's bothered to explain it to them. And if you look at COVID, actually what you can see is that people do respond to public information and clear public information. I would argue that the information hasn't been sitting in a sort of largely unventilated room. The information hasn't always been all that clear. But I think there is a lesson there in terms of people's willingness to act if they can see the point of acting and if they understand what they can actually do that makes a difference. And I think particularly given, you know, as you said, we've done the first half of cutting our emissions, but the next half is a lot harder. Having that clear information so that people can act, I think could be really effective and an important lesson learned.
Richard?
Yeah, I'll be slightly flippant. COVID resulted in an increase in recycling rates distinctly because everyone was drinking far too much alcohol and the glass bottles were all going out. Glass recycling rates went through the roof during COVID. Yeah. In terms of longer systemic change on waste, we saw with the recycling centres closed, we saw a significant increase in fly tipping, and one of the first things I did when I had the opportunity was get rid of a booking system and get people back to the recycling centres, because talking about 40% of our regular residents who would go to a recycling centre weren't during COVID, and weren't with a booking system because they weren't. If you work, it didn't help. If you were retired, it was wonderful. So I don't know if that's about the only actual evidence I've got of what the impact of COVID was.
So we saw domestic recycling rates rocket, cardboard from all the deliveries became a really challenge. Actually, it became a limiting factor in the sites, particularly around Christmas. Christmas is always a difficult time anyway, or the week after Christmas, and it became extremely difficult around COVID. The other thing that it did is it caused us to question the whole kind of how we do recycling in offices and on the go, because actually when people are at home and it's all available to them, people want to do it, but we make it incredibly difficult for people. Like you were saying around here, the fact that you've got different types of bins, and of course the bins aren't the same here as they will be at the train station, they'll be different wherever. So that whole kind of how you enable people to recycle when they're on the go, which is actually often when they get an awful lot more packaging because you buy packaged food and things like that. That was the thing that we noticed, and I think in terms of policy, particularly deposit return, and whether that's the right answer, was a kind of a key thing that emerged for us. So I think that's for us what COVID really did. It demonstrated that we're still making it far too hard for people in offices.
Thank you, Tim. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to start to wrap things up. So if each of the panellists would like to deliver your brief closing remarks, and I always ask this question at party conference, if you had one policy ask for government, what would it be? Tim Lord, I'll go to you first. Or you're still writing, I can go.
I think the main closing remark I would have is learn the lessons of what we've done well and apply them, but actually genuinely learn the lessons about people's willingness to act and the impact that you can have if you make it easy to act. I think in the waste space, the key ask I would have is about simplicity, because there's just too much complexity for consumers. That doesn't mean central government decreeing exactly what every single bin in the country looks like, but it does mean central government stepping up to the plate on the things that it needs to, and then delegating to local authorities once they've got the stuff they need from central government, and that central government can do, they can then take decisions that are appropriate to their local areas and their own circumstances.
Thank you, Tim. Richard, closing remarks and your policy wish list.
Policy wish list could be very long. I think simplicity in recycling is really important. I think if we could have that, if we could have legislation that reduces packaging rather than relying on supermarkets to do it themselves, that would force things through. Local government and central government need to talk about. The central government needs to set a framework, but they need to talk to us about the delivery of it at the same time, if we're ever going to bring people with us. And we've set back public transport in this country significantly by the approach that's been taken around active travel and imposition of cycle lanes and the various sort of people-friendly streets. It's caused far more harm than good because it's tried to be imposed from on high. But the biggest one I'll come back to, I'm afraid, is nothing to do with waste. Stop building homes that aren't zero carbon right now.
And finally, Tim Rotheray.
So can I have two policy wishes?
Go on.
Because I think they're both part of the same thing, which is if we want to increase recycling rates, and we've heard a lot about the levelling up agenda over the last couple of days, then we need to put in place a system for long-term contracts in the recycling sector so that we can build really good quality UK-based infrastructure to do the recycling and the reprocessing, turning it back into raw materials. That's the first thing that I would do, and that's DEFRA's job. And BEIS, I would get to include energy from waste in carbon capture. And you do those two things, and I reckon that this sector could become the first sector in the UK to hit zero carbon.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to our audience, both here in person and our virtual audience as well, for attending. A round of applause for our panellists.